We are continuing our conversation with Representative Kip Kendrick, and today we are discussing the legislative process. Representative Kendrick, talk about a bill that you have sponsored that passed the legislature, and describe the process from the beginning, if you would.
Yeah, be happy to. So, again, running unopposed, after it was basically determined that I was going to be unopposed in that first election, I immediately kind of switched my focus to, okay, how can I be effective when I get in the building? Because campaigning and being a member of the General Assembly are two completely different things. There's some overlap at times, but for the most part, they're completely separate. So, focus in right away on what I wanted to do, and healthcare being an important issue to the district, and innovation and technology being important as well. I focus in on a passion of mine, which is working with kids, and in particular, I worked for a number of years in the social service field before entering politics, about 7 years, and in particular, I'm very interested in addressing issues of ongoing chronic health conditions facing students or children. 25% of kids in the United States have some type of ongoing chronic health condition. So I became familiar with and introduced to Rachel Mutual at Missouri Telehealth Network, and developed a strong bond with Rachel immediately. She's a fantastic individual. She runs a great organization. And she introduced me the idea and concept of school-based telehealth, and it's something that is operated in 13 other states. But the idea is that you take a kid where they're at and provide them access to health care in that facility. So, school nurse goes to the classroom, pulls a student out, goes to the nurse's office and sets up a Skype basically, yeah. Right, with the medical professional on the other end, and the kid is back in the classroom within 10 to 15 minutes, and that ongoing, maybe that asthma inhaler is prescriptions renewed, or their asthma levels are checked to make sure that they're not going to have that next asthma attack that may land them in the ER or worse in the hospital. And as someone growing up in rural Missouri, I remember having to drive 2 hours sometimes to get to a medical specialist for an appointment, and then having to wait 45, 50 minutes in the doctor's office for a 10-minute visit. So the idea and concept of school-based telehealth is pretty revolutionary, but also pretty simple at the same time. Just take the kids where they're present, and make it as easy as accessible as possible. So first off, it was trying to identify what was the roadblock, what was blocking something like school-based telehealth from existing in the state of Missouri, and quick research identified that Medicaid, Missouri Health Net, would not allow for schools to be an originating site for telehealth services, and so as meeting with potential stakeholders involved in the process, meeting with Medicaid, understanding the concerns, meeting with school officials throughout the state, not just here in Columbia, but meeting with school officials throughout the state, meeting with school nurses, trying to understand their concerns or their interest in it. And I'll just say school nurses were very interested in this concept, because oftentimes, a lot of school nurses I talk to, they're somewhat removed from the medical field, right? They're often just putting a Band-Aid on someone, giving some medicine, but they feel somewhat removed. So when I would often talk to school nurses about the idea of school-based telehealth, they loved it, because all of a sudden they're back into the medical community, and they understand the health concerns of their students better than anyone else does. So it was a pretty simple piece of legislation. It was adding school to the originating site. I mean, it was sometimes simple is better when it comes to legislation, right? I mean, it really is. The less words you can use, the less it can be construed to mean something else. So it was a simple piece of legislation that I got rolled up into a larger bill that was moving at that time regarding expanding telehealth services. And I worked on the larger bill, but the schools was my piece of that I wanted to make sure. And so I got that rolled up into the bill. It goes through the committee process, and we get to the House committee, and immediately there's some concerns. Well, what if this is an excuse for parents to bring sick kids to school. We heard that immediately, and that kind of caught fire all of a sudden in the committee. Like, oh, no, they're going to pull schools out of this bill. I can't allow that to happen. So immediately it was an education piece to quickly conversations with members of the committee, like, no, if a kid comes to school sick, they can immediately send that kid home without accessing school-based telehealth, right? Like, I mean, there are ways to prevent the abuse of the system. And there are ways to make sure that the parents are involved in this process, right? Like, schedule it in such a time where it's happening at drop-off, so the parent can come in and be involved. Or, if the parent doesn't necessarily care to be involved, then, make sure they're provided a note at the end of the day. So it was really talking through some of those issues, and thankfully, I developed relationships with individuals in North Carolina who are doing school-based health very well. And so they'd already been through these problems or had seen these questions pop up. So I, would call them immediately and say, hey, here's the question that popped up. What kind of answer do you have for me? How did you troubleshoot this? And so, Missouri being a show me state, us not being the first into the field, but me being able to call other people really helped. And so we got that, didn't get across the finish line in 2015, my first session, but we did get across the finish line in 2016. Mo Health Net Division set up a task force then to figure out how to implement the larger bill, but also how to implement the school-based LO. So setting kind of rules and regulations around the newly formed statute. And nothing against Mo Health Net, they dragged their feet though. So this last legislative session, 2018 legislative session, we had to come back in and basically set a parameter that said standard of care, as long as a telehealth service meets the same standard of care as an in-person visit, then it can qualify for reimbursement for the originating sites and for the different parameters that were set in that 2016 legislation. So we kind of came in a roundabout way, set in the rules and regulation into statute. And now, here in the near future, Cardinal Glennon out of St. Louis, as well as Children's Mercy in Kansas City, are going to be implementing school-based telehealth in urban school districts in the city of St. Louis and Kansas City, and I'd expect it to expand throughout the state, hopefully, in the near future.
So what are the metrics? How do you determine whether or not what you have gotten done works?
Right. Yeah. So I'll just focus on school-based telehealth. Yeah. So it was like, I think part of the issue is that some of the school districts that we talked to, immediately they were concerned about a mandate. They did not want a mandate on them. They felt like they're overburdened. They did not want to have to offer school-based telehealth if it didn't fit their agenda, or they just didn't have the resources to be able to provide something like that. So it was quickly, trying to educate them, understanding that this is not a mandate. This just allows you the opportunity to provide it. So, something like school-based telehealth, again, simple piece of legislation, very few words in the legislation on my piece of it, and again, very few words in the statute that we passed this year to implement the rules and regulation. But I see success is kind of in this way, getting out of the way of the hospitals and the medical community to be able to actually go in there and figure out exactly what's going to work best. Having had a conversation with Children's Mercy or Cardinal Glennon and understanding the level of complexity that goes into telehealth services now, and having conversations with many physicians and medical specialists. I have full faith that they're going to figure out how to make this successful if they think it can be, and making sure that our statute is reflected in such a way that kind of gets out of the way, that makes this accessible for them to be able to use as a tool, and I think that's how I'm going to judge success on it, is allowing them to move forward. Sometimes
it is as important to keep a bill from being passed as it is to get one passed. In your experience, what's a bill that you can say, I kept that bill from hitting the governor's desk and it's a good thing and here's why? Sure.
I think going back to my first, I think this is my first session, I was serving on a health insurance committee. And there was a bill related to EPOs, which is exclusive provider organizations, similar to HMOs. Now, this is very technical at this point, but similar to HMOs, but more of a gatekeeper function and more of a limited network. Missouri, a certain insurance company wanted to be able to provide an EPO with more of a gatekeeper function, but that also had a high deductible plan tied to it. And contrary to our show me state motto, this company wanted to be the first, wanted Missouri to be the first state in the nation to be able to do this. And so that immediately kind of raised some red flags, like, oh, what's going on here? And then, immediately having conversations with hospital associations, as well as different healthcare providers, and them providing research to me that even some independent research where this had been explored by many companies previously, but there was a large concern that limiting the network in such a way and putting in a gatekeeper function, but then also providing the high deductible option for this would lead to more bad debt on not only the consumer end of it. So you would likely see more bankruptcy, but you'd also see more bad debt taken on by hospitals. And in Missouri right now, that's a major issue. I think, without getting too political, I think part of us not accepting a Medicaid expansion population has put even more of an increased burden on some of our rural hospitals. And with we're basically mid-October of 2018, and we just saw another hospital, I think the 8th hospital in the last few years, shut down in the state of Missouri just this week. So it was really going at it from that way. And to get back to your original question, right? Like how did it prevent it? Being a member of a super minority, by the time a bill hits the floor, it is hard to stop the momentum of it getting out of the House. Now you can work the Senate. If a bill gets out of the House, you can work senators because you have more of an opportunity to roadblock something on that end. But that's more of an education piece that you would work with on senators. But when you're a super minority, it's really working the committee. And I worked early on to try to make the bill better. Like, how can you amend this bill to make it better? And then eventually it just became clear that no one was interested in amendments, and the individuals pushing it were not interested in amendments. So at that point, it was working to keep the bill from getting out of committee, delaying votes, and then by the time that we were ready to move forward with a vote, making sure that the votes were there to actually make sure that it didn't pass. And it didn't. It wasn't just me, but it was a number of us on the committee that were not interested in seeing that bill move forward at that time.
Speaking of committees, which committees are you on in the state legislature? Why did you choose those particular committees? And how, in fact, do you get selected to committees in the Missouri State Legislature?
Yeah. So I currently serve on the Budget Committee, ranking Democratic member for Budget Committee. I serve on Higher Education Committee, Pensions Committee, and then a couple of, going along with Budget Committee, I serve on Education Appropriations Subcommittee. So that's part of the larger Budget Committee, but a specialty area for looking at K-12 and higher education budget. And then I serve on a couple legislative appointments outside of the body, but that do come from the Speaker's office. So I serve on the Missouri Consolidated Healthcare Plan Board of Trustees, which is the state employee health insurance plan. And then I also serve on the Missouri Healthcare Facility Review Committee as vice chairman of that committee. And pretty much that committee is any new project, any new hospital or any new nursing home, assisted living facility of that ilk, same ilk, is going to have to come through that committee for approval in order to move forward. So, I think the committees that I'm on represent my interest. A lot of time and energy is taken up by Budget Committee. And it is a place where I found, as a member of super minority, to be likely most effective. Not likely, that's where I am most effective, I feel like, in the building. Serving as ranking member, I've got a great relationship with the budget chair, got a great relationship with the vice chair, and for a body that has rapid turnover and age of term limits, I feel like I have a fairly decent understanding of our state budget. Now, there is a lot more to know. It's a complex $28.7 billion budget with a lot of different line items throughout and a lot of different programs that you fund. But I've spent a lot of time and energy trying to understand the budget because, Budget Committee I found to be one of the least partisan committees in the body, right? You're given a finite number of resources, a finite number of dollars that you have to budget, the Budget Committee. And the budget always originates in the House, and we send it to the Senate. So when we have the first crack at the budget, it's for the most part, whether you're Republican or Democrat, rural or urban, a lot of priorities overlap, and so I find the Budget Committee to be a place where I can get things done, where I can work well with all members, and we can try to deliver things for the district or deliver things for projects and programs that are important to the state.
And of course, the university is going to be an important constituent in that regard.
Very important constituent. And that was one of the first conversations I had with my predecessor before he backed me. Is like, you listen to the university and you make sure you remember that that's an important part of the district, and obviously it is. Unfortunately, we've seen state support for public higher education and higher education in general. Some of our scholarship programs, grant programs, kind of dissipate over the last several years as far as their share of the budget, but it is an important program. And in years of budget cuts, which in 2017 session, working on the FY18 budget, we had to look at cutting $500 million out of the budget. And when you talk about that in a $28.7 billion budget, it may not seem like a whole lot, but you also have to understand that basically a third of that is of that 28.7 is general revenue, and 500 million had to come out of general revenue. So 500 million out of 9 billion is, especially when a lot of those dollars are earmarked, first already spoken for. Then that was a lot of difficult decisions had to be made that year, and it was, and as you said earlier about killing bills. It's oftentimes I found that in years of cuts, it can be more important to protect programs than in years of, I haven't seen many years of surplus, but in years of surplus trying to get them funding.
Understood,
So,
yeah. So you are in the minority party in the legislature, as you mentioned. How successful have you been working across the aisle with Republicans who have, as you also mentioned, a supermajority? And describe what that means.
Sure, yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make. When I say superminority, we're great, but it also means we're in a superminority. Supermajority is over 2/3 of the House and over 2/3 of the Senate belong to, are controlled by the majority party, by Republicans at this point. And so that's a significant number, and it's an important number because that's a veto-proof. It's a veto-proof majority as long as the Republicans can keep their members in line. Especially when my first 2 years there, we had a Democratic governor. If they could keep their members in line, then they could obviously override the governor. Now with the Republican governor, it's less important, but we would like to, obviously, as Democrats, to gain more members heading into 2020 with the opportunity potentially to take back the executive branch. I always joke, being in a superminority means majority party basically chooses your office, chooses where you park. Don't choose where you go to the bathroom, but proximity to the office, you kind of set up that way. There's a lot of control that comes along with being a member of the majority party and being in a supermajority that much more. I joke somewhat freeing to be in a superminority, and as I'm the Democratic whip, right? Like I'm supposed to get people in line, but at times. A lot of times there are bills where it just doesn't matter how Democrats vote. So being whip, it's really an education piece and trying to get people in line when you need them to be, but it's an education piece on trying to get members to understand how their vote may affect them politically in a mailer, how it may look in a mailer, how it may play in their district. But it's also freeing in the fact that I get to vote. At times I feel like I get to vote more in my district. more of my conscience at time, maybe more so than a supermajority would, where some people may be uneasy about a vote, but they need them to stay in line, especially, again, the first 2 years on overriding a governor's veto. So a little more freeing, but definitely can be frustrating. I work well. It's not my personality to, like I said, it's not my personality to fight just for fighting's sake. I'll stand up for what I believe in. There are times when I get angry and get heated, but it's about developing relationships. It's a building where relationships are critical, especially in a super minority. You have to have trust. You have to be trusted, and so I want to get things done. I don't feel like, I could go down there and throw bombs and likely be reelected in my district until I term out. I think I could. But that's not my personality, and delivering and being effective on budget committee is more important to me. So I work on developing relationships. Again, stand up for when I need to stand up, but have worked well with Republicans and Democrats alike. And there are members of both parties who frustrate me.
And I think working across the aisle, for example, with the university, the majority of representatives from this area are Republicans, but all of you, regardless of partisan affiliation, are going to do everything you can to maximize university funding and support in the legislature for the university's programs. So, I think that's an obvious example of where working across the aisle is almost like not taken for granted, it's too strong a word, but at the same time, there's probably some issues where it is just, yeah, I'm going to work with Republicans here because it is in the interest of the area I'm from,
Sure.
as opposed to, some statewide or national concern.
That's right. And, I think a lot of the issues that get picked up by the media, and it's not the media's concern, or just get picked up by the general public, revolve around hot button issues. Because, they get more clicks and they tend to be a little bit more interesting too, right? But there's a lot of work that is done that, a lot of the votes that we take are 120, 130 plus yes votes on things. It's just about updating statute and cleaning up statute a lot of the times. And there are plenty of good things to work on that are nonpartisan, that are that just can put our state in a better position. And it's about finding those things and working on them. And I think the bills that I file represent that. Even some of the bills that I filed, I've purposefully maybe even taken a little bit more conservative slant on than I would typically, I would have done otherwise. But like, if I want to see my bill move, like, you gotta make sure that it at first glance, at first read, it is seen as something that can move through a supermajority of Republicans.
Anything else about the legislative process, Representative Kendrick, that we should cover?
Yeah, it is a building that is full of processes and full of different rules to follow. I absolutely love my time in the body. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the institution. So serving in the body is an honor, and it's constantly a learning process. I think we'll talk more about term limits in an upcoming video, but it takes a while to get that first session. You're really doing everything you can to keep your head above water and learn, how things move. But here I am 4 years in, going to start my 5th year in 2019, and I feel confident about where I am, my understanding of the process, but I also understand there's still more to learn to be effective, and so you just have to be open to learning more and understanding that you may not have all the answers. So.
We've been talking with Representative Kip Kendrick about the legislative process in the Missouri General Assembly, and we will return to an interview with him and talk about interest groups and lobbying.